This is the Better Software Faster podcast, where we deep dive into the intersection of tech and business to demystify, unravel, and explore concepts that you can apply to your own organization. From pipelines to processes, forecasting to fine-tuning, best practices to balance sheets, we draw on all of our customer-facing experience to bring you the best high-level talking points. Hello and welcome to the BSF podcast. I'm your host Adam Godwin with ReleaseWorks. Today we're going to be talking about the cloud adoption lifecycle, when to move into the cloud, when to develop within the cloud, and when to potentially move back out of the cloud. Joining me today is Miro, our CEO, and Amos, our COO, and it's going to be a great discussion. So, Miro, I'll kick it over to you first to lead things. If you could set the stage for how would you start a cloud adoption lifecycle as a startup?
Well, I think from a startup point of view, typically cloud is the default destination, right? As a startup, you typically don't start thinking about setting up a data center somewhere, right? You might start thinking about running servers on a virtual server provider if you are not very familiar with how the cloud works and kind of familiar with the cloud native technology stack, like serverless and managed containers and things like this. But from a startup point of view, typically you start with a small team of developers, right? And developers love cloud native, as you well know, right? So if developers get their choice, they tend to go for a cloud native technology stack from the get-go, and that's absolutely fine, right? The whole point of cloud native is to enable and empower the developer team to be autonomous in their space, right? So you don't need to have systems administrators in the team to run servers for you. You can kind of shift a lot of that stuff to the development team themselves, right? We're talking about infrastructure as code. We're talking about configuration of code as code, everything as code, right? So from that point of view, the cloud adoption, for better or worse, tends to happen on its own, right? And sometimes that happens without proper control, without proper strategy behind it, right?
Yeah, maybe I could just give a couple of words on the controls and strategies. I love the flexibility and agility of cloud native, particularly for startup and dev, because it gives you the shortest route to potential new customers or to trialing and testing, particularly in an MVP environment. But I think it's also true that when you're working directly with cloud and you don't have any form of internal infrastructure, there's a networking layer, an infrastructure layer that's missing. And you might see that as a very structural, simple way to get out into the public domain, but it's also a safeguard against costs. And that mightn't seem obvious, but what I mean by that is that if you now have a lead developer that's in control of spinning up new functions inside a cloud environment, then every time something is spun up, it's starting to cost money from the second that's done. So you need to be really, really careful about how you budget for that, make your team aware that everything that you touch costs money, and have a really clear understanding of what your monthly commitments are, because it can really spiral out of control. Not only that, and I'm not trying to scaremonger, it's just a fact that people turn stuff on in order to test stuff and then forget to turn it off. And guess what? These things drag on, and you've got a nice wedge of costs that you're actually not using but paying for over a period of time. So these things, I think we need to change the mentality and the strategy for operationally managing this type of infrastructure, so that there's a really clear understanding and maybe some level of authority provided when people want to turn on more stuff that's going to cost money, and a wrap up in order to be able to turn it off after a period of time when they're no longer using it. So I love the concept, but it's not all sweetness and light. There are bits and pieces you need to consider here.
Absolutely, and yeah, cost is definitely one of the typical things we come across in organizations who have started off their cloud adoption journey without kind of the proper frameworks and guidelines in place, right? The other thing is security, right? You mentioned, the typical kind of traditional network environment being a safety net for costs. It absolutely is the same for security as well, right? In the cloud environment, the difference between having a server public or private can be just single tick box, right? And if a person who doesn't really understand deeply how network security is supposed to work, and how kind of things like subnets and firewall rules and things like this work, they often make a mistake in what should be running where and what should be open to what, right? So we come across things like database servers being open to the world on cloud environments that have been built by startups, because they haven't really understood that actually database servers should only be reachable by our application rather than everyone in the internet, right? So there are kind of fundamental issues in both, I think, cost and security if you start doing it organically without kind of putting a proper structure and strategy around it. Absolutely.
And I think just a word on that. It's just my own opinion, but I think since cloud has become so pervasive, I think the general level of awareness and understanding of common security skills has gone down. Even though there's a very high level of understanding that security is extremely important, I think the fact that it's so easy to build and implement architecture in the cloud has made people more blasé about the security parameters and protocols that fit around them. As you say, you can spin up something really, really quickly, but it could also be available to the world on an IP address that everybody can see to have access to. So there are structures and infrastructures and methodologies and protocols that need to be controlled and understood and owned internally, whether you're in the cloud or you're not. I just feel that sometimes being in the cloud has made it easier for people to body swerve that just for the sake of getting up there quickly, and end up having a lot of tech debt behind to solve that problem later on, or worse, having some kind of chaotic problem to deal with, which unfortunately does happen from time to time as well.
The piece that you mentioned there about having a good sysadmin background or a good networking background, I think that's something that we've actually seen in our own hiring, right? We used to recruit people who had that kind of background, and then we would slowly build up their cloud skills. And now it's a little bit different. We're recruiting people with cloud skills who don't have the foundational backing of sort of Linux servers and things like that. I wanted to go back to another point that you made. You said about the starting out cloud native can be a bit of a developer's sort of kid in a candy store, right? They have all of these options, all of these buttons, and not a care in the world. And it sounds like it might be the CTO's job to kind of be a bit of a CFO at the same time, and not just have budgets, but kind of a visual outline in mind of where these costs are coming from. We've seen this with one of our customers recently, where they're creating a lot of on-demand environments and they don't get closed off properly, so then they're just running in the background. No one knows they're there, and it sort of builds up and builds up and builds up. So what would be some sort of effective mitigation strategies for a CTO in that kind of area to see the whole picture and make sure their cloud costs are actually not just spiraling out of control?
I think from a CTO perspective, from budget and cost management perspective, the first step is to admit you have a problem, right? So the first step is to actually start to track it, right? There are great tools out in the market for providing cloud cost analysis and cloud cost optimization. A lot of tools already natively available on the cloud platforms for you to use to optimize your workloads, and keep tabs on what's costing a lot of money and what isn't, right? Especially in larger cloud estates, you need to really do exception management, right? You need to ignore the bits and pieces that cost you pennies, right? Because there are a lot of bits and pieces that cost you pennies, and concentrate on the ones that actually move the needle, right? So from a technology perspective, lots of great tools out there. You just need to use them, right? You need to configure them to work for your use case. One kind of low-level thing that organizations are starting to do really well is tagging resources, right? Being able to point that, okay, this container cluster belongs to Adam in the project, whatever, right? And it's being used for testing. So it's not a production workload. Things like that which then trickle down to the cloud cost management tools to bring rich reports on what's costing and so on.
Yeah, I have to admit, I've seen a couple of horror stories here, and when you have a reliance upon cloud and it grows in a way that you can't quite believe, and I have yet to meet a CFO that can properly understand an AWS or an Azure bill. They just throw their hands up because it's 15 pages long. It's full of an entirely different set of information that they just don't understand. It's totally granular as it needs to be, but it's you can't interpret it. So going back to your point, Adam, this needs to be owned by the CTO, right? Because they are the conduit to the commercial piece. It costs money. Everything costs money. So they need to own the budget for it, and they need to review and own that bill when it comes through every month and lift the drains and figure out that it is doing exactly what they need it to do, so that they can explain that properly through at CFO level. And if there's an opportunity to save costs, then there are different layers and levels that they can go to in order to be able to look at that. Because the fact that it may be increasing in price may be entirely valid. We're scaling. There's lots of reasons for that. But we've also come across, with customers that will remain nameless, situations where they've had, let's say, 40, 50 test environments running, created by different pools of software developers in different geographies, still running 18 months, 2 years after they were created. This is just poor management. People aren't looking at this, and you'll keep getting billed for this stuff if you don't turn it off. So for me, it's absolutely something that must be owned by the CTO. They must be accountable and responsible for it, and they have to be the bridge for that cost and the evaluation and explanation of that cost all the way up the line back into finance, because it gets expensive very quickly. Well, we could talk about different ways to mitigate costs if you want, because that's both an infrastructure and if you like, a planning function. Do you want to do that, Miro?
Well, yeah. I think in terms of cost mitigation, obviously, being able to pinpoint where the cost is coming from is key, right? But then there are lots you can do to optimize your workload. You can right size your resource allocations. You can refactor your application to take more advantage of flexible resources, right? To bring your unit of scale lower and unit of scale smaller, so your cost base actually follows your demand much closer than before. There are lots of techniques that you can kind of start to chip away and reduce the cost. And like I said, for example, in AWS, there are great tools to give you recommendations on what you should be doing to optimize your cost. Right, and obviously having a professional do a deep dive into your application stack, and not just kind of the infrastructure side of it on the surface, but actually deep dive to understand what the dependencies of your application are and what the moving parts of your application are, and then start figuring out where the low-hanging fruit are. What are the things that will provide the most bang for your buck if you start optimizing them. It's typically something that we do in a cost optimization scenario, right? But Amos, as you said, typically the first port of call is to figure out if there are things that we can do to kill off test environments when they're not being used. Schedule them to shut down when they're not being used, or go from kind of a server-based virtual server infrastructure into something like a much more horizontally scalable container-based infrastructure, which brings its own benefits in terms of scalability and lower cost when there's lower demand. And
a lot of that is determined by where you are in your development cycle, right? Because if if we go back to what we were talking about in terms of startups, you're not going to have enough knowledge and enough precedent to know whether or not that the refactoring of some of your infrastructure is actually a valid thing or a worthwhile thing, or even possible in the short to medium term, because you just don't have enough data or enough throughput. But it is something that organizations don't do later on in the maturity of the life cycle of the application, when perhaps they could. And there's a real opportunity to make it more granular and split it out into separate types of services that could be much more pinpoint in terms of scale and cost in terms of cloud usage.
There's another adoption path that organizations, scale ups and more mature organizations take into the cloud, right? And that is migrating into the cloud from an established data center or different hosting provider. And one of the paths organizations tend to take is to lift and shift their workload into the cloud, right? Which in itself is a very valid way of doing it, and it's actually one of the typically recommended ways of starting a cloud migration, to lift and shift your existing workload into the cloud. The thing from a cost and management perspective is that this is a phrase that is thrown around very often. Don't build data centers in the cloud, right? But really, what it means from a cost perspective is that if you were running 25 servers and you lift and shift those 25 servers into the cloud on an on-demand payment logic, then typically you will end up paying more for those servers than you did in your old data center, right? But that's not where the benefits of cloud adoption really come from. The benefits of that come from then you being able to refactor your workload in the cloud, right? You being able to start using cloud native technologies in your workload, instead of doing what you did for the past 25 years, which is running servers, right? And you're kind of getting the benefits of being able to deliver change faster with less operational overheads, especially from a human perspective. If you start offloading those responsibilities into the cloud provider itself by using cloud native technologies. So typically, from a cost perspective, one of the things that we see, especially with larger organizations, is that they lift and shift their workload in the cloud and expect that it should be cheaper, right? But typically it's not. You only get the benefits, and you get the cost benefits as well when you start integrating yourself into the cloud ecosystem natively.
Okay. Well, so we've pivoted the conversation around more to sort of scale ups, which is good. We should talk about that as well. One of the things we've noticed then with people that kind of come to us with their problems is, they're not leveraging cloud native. They have done, as you said, sort of like a lift and shift, building a data center in the cloud, building a server in the cloud, just getting it out of the physical tin and into the cloud. When we talk about sort of microservices and dissolving these monoliths down into more manageable chunks, obviously that does come with like a fairly sizable kind of config and admin overhead as well. Is there a pivot point, you'd say, where it kind of makes sense to look at microservices from an organizational perspective, rather than it's too much work, it's going to be too hard to manage, so let's just keep it running the way we're running it?
I think depends what you mean by microservices. Are you talking about pure microservices, or are you talking about more manageable monoliths, right?
Separate components with messaging queues.
Yeah. If you talk about more manageable chunks of application estate, typically that tends to be a good way of starting to chip away your big one huge monolith, right? Organizations usually are not prepared to actually go through the microservice route and building individual tiny services which only do one thing, right? Typically that comes with a management overhead that is way too large for the benefits that you might get from a pure microservices approach, right? So typically, you're much better off thinking of service-oriented architectures, which are split into domains of responsibility and things like this to ensure that things are scalable on their own, right? But not every function or individual piece of logic is split into its own long-running service, right? Now that said, obviously there is there's a different but very much aligned paradigm around serverless, where you do either functions as a service or things like fully managed containers and so on. I think there's a very good use case for things like functions as a service, where you only pay for invocation of that single function, and typically when you have very sporadic workloads, very sporadic demand, which might spike up to 100,000 requests this minute, and then it might be completely quiet for the next 12 hours, right? In requirements like that, there's a clear use case for actually just paying for the single invocations as they come, rather than committing to a higher level of cost.
Well, can I give you a couple of ideas around that, because I really like what you're saying there around how these functions can be distributed, but they can all run in parallel, right? So it's not either or. You can and should consider doing both. But I think I would bring it out to a level of abstraction now, that this should be cost oriented. So I'm going to be a little bit selfish here talking about costs, because I know it's super important, and I know how easily they can get out of control. It's not fair just to talk specifically about costs, because if you're going to bring something in that has a low cost but an extremely high maintenance overhead, then it's actually not worth doing, right? Because you're just moving the cost from one place to another. But if you're looking at for the reasoning to go down a particular route, so why would you go down, let's say, a serverless Lambda route for one function versus building something in a container? It's not just about volume. There is a cost impact to that there. So if you're looking at designing this and you're looking at determining, let's say you've been through an MVP, you're starting to see flow, you're starting to see precedent, you're getting data in your application that allows you to make longer term decisions, which is what we're all looking for. Well, then now is that inflection point for you to decide, well, what is the best way for us to manage the costs and provide the service? The end user is going to see the same result one way or another, right? The function is going to work one way or another. What you need to decide is what's the most flexible, scalable function at the right cost for you to be able to manage this and deliver this over time. Most people don't think about it from the cost angle. The technical people and the developers are looking at what's the best technical solution, but that may not be the right cost solution, right? So I think the first thing I want to say is I want people to start looking at it from that angle too, because it's really, really important. What Miro said about microservices is also really valid. And where you have people that are scaling up with a monolithic application, they're still being built, right? That you want to be able to bring this into a data center environment, or rather into a cloud environment, it's particularly difficult. It's hard to do. And also, from somebody that looks at this from a cost perspective, you've invested a tremendous amount of money to create all the IP that you have that is currently working for your subscription and your cost base and your revenue base. There is very little or very rarely justification to rewrite that application into 100 different microservices just to do it a different way so we can scale differently. Why would you do that, right? It doesn't. There is no real cost justification for it. So the way to do it is to actually to eat it from the inside and to slowly morph into something that is more distributed over time. So instead of adding a whole new piece of functional code into a monolithic application, build a series of independent service-oriented architectures for those new functions and start to independently distribute those. And then when you have upgrades, or where you have changes or tech debt that you're refactoring, look at how and look at if it is valuable to distribute those or create those as independent services too. So instead of having one project that actually takes something and just goes binary from non-service to service or to microservice, look at how you might distribute this and break it out over a period of time. Because for me, if you do it the other way around, you're not necessarily going to get the cost benefit from it, or the return on that cost benefit, for years, if ever.
Fantastic. This is really valuable information. And I think one thing that I've already taken away from this conversation is there's absolutely no way of breaking the financial part out of the equation, right? Certainly not with you on the call, Amos. But in general, the whole conversation about cloud adoption has to be framed through things like the running cost, the investment cost, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, developers would just do whatever the hell they wanted.
I've unfortunately been in this game a lot longer than both of you, and I've seen it from both sides. And when you first start to bring the server infrastructure into a data center, let's say before it went into the cloud, there was a cost infrastructure there that was unavoidable. If you had a network architecture and your development team wanted a new database server, or they wanted a new web server, or whatever it might be, that had to go through a procurement process. So it might have been stopped right there. So it was the tin that was the barrier to entry before anything else happened. And then when that was done and it was procured and everybody was happy and they knew what the costs were, then you had to organize the network team to go and build it and get it implemented and tested and get it running and get it working. So there was a very long time gap, but that was all controlled by cost. That's all gone now. All of it's gone. It is literally your lead developer going into an admin console and going, let's go. That's fantastic until you see the bill, right? So you have to be in control of those costs or they will spiral out of control because, quite frankly, and understandably, a lot of lead software developers don't care about how much it costs. They're under pressure to deliver deployable code. So you can't have it both ways. You must be accountable for those costs and manage them in a different way to how it used to be. I don't think we're ever going back to where it was, right? But that doesn't mean the costs don't go away, or go away rather, because in many ways it's more expensive now, and cloud is not cheap. It's very comparable in terms of cost, but you get the benefit of the scalability, etc., to be able to scale it up or scale it down.
What you say, Amos, is absolutely true, but I think there's been a bit of a shift in the cost base in the first place, right? I think tin used to be expensive, people used to be cheaper, and I think it's very much the other way around now, right? If you think of your example of having to procure a server and then get your network team to set it up and get your data center team to install it and whatnot, if that takes 4 months, you're going to end up paying your developer 4 months before they can actually get something out live, right?
Yeah.
And that is, especially today, that's a huge cost, right? And being able to get your development team deliver their thing right away without waiting for another
hugely
team.
Valuable. Yeah, hugely valuable.
Exactly. So a lot of the kind of the downsides are offset by the fact that everything's just so much faster to do now from an infrastructure perspective, right? But yeah, you're absolutely right. It is something that needs to be properly controlled with a proper framework, or it will spiral out of control.
Yeah. It's the best of both worlds is what you're looking for. The speed of deployment is extremely valuable, right? And outweighs everything else in terms of control, right? But if you're not controlling the costs, it will bite you. It really will. And you won't know why until it's too late, because once you've got the bill, it's too late. You're paying for it, right? But it is something that can and should be managed.
I think that's the perfect segue to sort of talking about, for the more mature companies that are in the cloud, and let's just say for the sake of argument, their product is more or less finished in terms of the kind of like how they want it to run in terms of the architecture, the scalability, and so on. When we're talking about cloud adoption, probably the last thing that comes to mind is, okay, when are we going to move back out of the cloud? But it's something we see. And I think that's very, very interesting. So when would it make sense to start considering, moving things into data centers and things like that?
Well, from cost perspective, not talking about security or anything like that. From a cost perspective, for me, I think the things that you will do before you end up in this conversation is committing to a certain level of use, right? All the cloud providers have a way for you to commit to a certain level of cost or certain resources and get very, very considerable discounts off of that. You can be looking at a discount of 60% versus your on-demand costs if you commit to a certain level of spend for 1, 2, 3 years, right? Which is something that you would do anyway if you were running that in your own data center. So typically there's a conversation where you have gone through the effort of committing to a certain cost. You've done your forward planning with the knowledge that your workload is unlikely to change in the next 3 years or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And based on that, you've been able to already get the savings of, say, 60% by taking full advantage of the commitments and savings plans, for example. But after that, we still calculate the cost to find the point where it's actually cheaper for you to go and buy the tins, right, and rent your data center, and size up your infrastructure based on the highest peak of demand that you envision you will have in the next year or 2 or 3, right, and you are fine with the fact that you won't be able to scale down your cost when there's less demand, right? But if the mathematics tell you that you're better off paying for the highest point of demand for the highest amount of servers all the time, and you still save money compared to running that same architecture flexibly in the cloud, then obviously it'll make sense for you to start considering moving away from the cloud and into dedicated infrastructure, right?
And I think for me, this is a strategic modeling exercise. And Miro is talking about, it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it's entirely true. But you can model all of this before you do anything or make any decisions. And I think what we're talking about here is that you're looking at an application set that is very mature in terms of its usability, its access, its control, its structure, and its normalized use patterns. And because you have that, you've got very strong predictability about how it's being used, how seasonal it is, how often it's being used, what those peaks are, what those glass floor and glass ceilings are. And because you have that, you know exactly how it's being used and how it's behaved and how you need to interact with it. Because you have that, you can model all of that with its predictability in terms of cloud costs, and you can model it in terms of what its predictability in terms of off-cloud costs would be. And so it's worth doing, even if the decision is no, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, or it's not worth the stress, or maybe we would have to reverse refactor out of the cloud to get, because we're using some cloud native functions that we just won't have when we go into, let's say, our own data center space. Maybe there are a dozen reasons not to do it in the end, but actually it's a really, really, really valid exercise. Let me throw one other thing into the mix here. Again, coming back from the cost perspective, your CTO will be looking at the cost for, let's say, using AWS or Azure. Every single penny of those costs is operational. So in other words, it all hits your P&L, all of it. Right? If you go back into an offsite or a data center oriented function, all the tin that you buy to support that goes directly onto your balance sheet and comes off your P&L. Right? So you're now taking all the costs for all of that tin, wherever it might be, and depreciating it over time below your EBITDA line. So it's now adding to or increasing the value of your EBITDA profitability, which is where your usually your valuation comes from. So there's more than one strategic reason why you might consider doing that. Now, this wouldn't be the only reason by any means, and it wouldn't be the driving reason by any means, but it's also something to bear in mind and consider, right? So I think that there are lots of reasons for you to look at it, but you could build a really neat model that compares one against the other strategically to look at that point, and there will be a crosshair in that graph that shows that your ongoing costs for doing this after a period of time will allow you to continue to sweat assets, continue to manage your infrastructure, even with a small team that's responsible for it, right? And do it more cheaply and more profitably than you're doing it through a complete OpEx function through a cloud system right now.
That's a great point. I'd throw another one in there as well. More something to consider when you do the calculations and when you build the model, right? Typically, if you do have a team of developers building and improving your product in the cloud, they use a certain toolkit that might be very much maintained for the cloud provider, or things like Terraform for infrastructure management, which works very well with cloud providers because that's what it's built to do, right? what I'm getting to is that if you do end up going down the route of building your own data center, there's going to be a cost for you to build the toolkit to manage that from an SDLC perspective as well, right? You will, if you still are improving your product, if you're just maintaining your product, you will still need to be able to do changes, right? You'll need to be able to do security patches. You'll need to be able to do hot fixes, even if your product is completely in the maintenance part of the life cycle rather than development, right? So you will still need to have the capability of delivering change into your data center through your delivery team with a proper toolkit to do so. So there's the cost of actually moving, but there's also the cost of facilitating what happens after the move when you go from cloud to a data center. Arguably, it's the same the other way around, right? So you can't get away with it either way.
So to sort of bring all of these points together then in kind of a summary. So if we were talking about, you're starting your origin point, if we say it's a startup, your recommendation is go straight to cloud native. Don't mess around with anything else. Jump straight to that point so you can start working on, rapid changes, scalability, things that developers like in terms of like pipelines and config as code. If you're a scale up and you have a product that's, monolithic, maybe think about breaking that down into smaller, more manageable components. You can start working out where your main cost centers are within the application. Or if it's an on-premise software, don't just port it directly to the cloud. Take the time to refactor it for that same benefit. And we call that sort of stage one. And then stage two would be, I suppose, the cost prediction model. Once you have things running the way they should be running, where are the main cost centers of the application? What can we do to sort of start bringing these down? Getting a more holistic view of not just here's my big AWS cloud bill with the name of each service, but what does all of this mean? Demystifying it, having the arduous task of explaining that to the CFO in words that they can understand. And then a sort of a more late stage recommendation would be, now that you have a good understanding of where your money is being spent, start working out what you can move back to tin and what's cheaper to run that doesn't maybe require as much change, but still leaves the door open for change where needed.
Spot on.
Is there anything missing from that equation, do you think?
I think the only thing I would say is that it is a use case by use case basis, right? And if you look at it, if you're an organization that only has one application, only delivering one application, it seems very easy just to keep an even keel, leave it in the cloud. You wouldn't dream of doing anything else because you don't have any of the resources to be able to manage it. You'd have to go and buy them, and it seems too hard, right? But too hard is one thing, but adding an extra 8% to your gross margin is altogether another after 3 or 4 or 5 years. Not only does it pay for this, but it actually justifies it. So you need to keep an open mind and consider what is the right thing to do. I would say it's probably in the less than 20% category of use cases that it is justifiable to move it out of the cloud back into a data center. But 1 in 5 is actually quite for me a material consideration. If you do that model instead of anecdotally saying no, it just doesn't make sense, I don't want to think about it. But if you actually did the modeling, which costs nothing, you would actually understand how close you are to whether or not this is a viable thing, or whether it will become viable in 18 months to 2 years, where you can pick up the model and kick the tires again, right? It's worth doing. It genuinely is. Again, it feels counterintuitive, but it's not. It's worth doing because it costs money.
One thing I'd say, just to echo that, I think the life cycle that we talk about doesn't automatically mean that you end up at some point in your life cycle end up moving away from the cloud. I think the more mature you get more data and you get more stability, which allow you to do the right decisions going forward, right? And yeah, for the vast majority of organizations and teams, that decision is to optimize in situ and get to a reasonable cadence within the same cloud environment that they've already been building in, right? But yeah, as always, it all depends.
Always. Fantastic. Well, we'll end it there. Thank you both very, very much, Phil. This was a really great conversation. Lots of good points that I'd never really considered before myself. We will be moving on to a third episode of the podcast shortly. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us at release.works/podcast. Miro, Amos, thank you both very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.